Hello, civilized people. You might have heard in recent weeks that we are apparently going to have a war, a glorious war, over what is truly one of the most pressing issues of our time. I speak, of course, of the greatest of scourges, the bane of civilization, razor wire to prevent illegal immigration. Yes, truly. When I think of causes that justify provoking a war in which millions of lives will be lost, this is certainly at the top of the list, right alongside McDonald's only offering the McRib seasonally, and the fact that the law does not actually allow me to give out handguns and PCP to fourth graders. Free country, my ass. And yet, strangely, somehow, this debate has caused a media stir, and people are now discussing the prospect of an armed conflict over the matter. It almost seems surreal, and yet here we are. Today, on the Goths and Rome podcast, we are going to look at our perfectly civilized roots as we hypothesize on exactly how the unthinkable could unfold. I speak, of course, of American Civil War Part 2, Electric Boogaloo. Now, before we get into things, I would like to tell our listeners that it is not our place to tell you what to think on the matters that are going on in the news. We, as always, encourage people to do their own research on such things, and I do mean actual research. Not listening to what some talking heads on MSNBC, Fox, CNN have to say. Let me be candid. They play their games, we play ours. It is our profession to do so. At least we have the decency to be candid about those games and not have the unwarranted sense of self importance to insist that you agree with us or that you are a fascist. Yeah, seriously, screw those guys. But anyway, so, Colton, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right, Robert. How about yourself?
Wonderfully. And Colt, this feels like a topic strangely suited for us. I mean, this is the Goths in Rome podcast, not the Goths in Iberia, or the Goths in Crimea, or the Goths in Pannonia, or the Goths in southern Sweden. So, civil conflict was pretty much necessary for us to get where we are today, I guess. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, yeah.
It's kind of on the label. But, you know, looking at all of this, and I mean, I think it's safe to say that we don't view it as a huge risk. So, we're going to analyze things, but we might make light of this. But, you know, just looking at the way things are, I've sort of put together a list of factions. And I just want to run this list by you to see if, you think that these groups are, a reasonable assortment. And the first group would be a progressive uprising. Do you think that's something that is possible? Not
Well,
whether it would succeed or not.
we kind of see a kindergarten version of that. We saw that what in 2020, like millions of
Ah,
people
yeah.
going into the streets.
The summer of love, as they call it.
Yes.
That was certainly, yeah. I think that displays that a progressive uprising could happen. Next up, an America First uprising.
Hmm. Should I say it now or should I say it later, Robert? You know what I'm gonna say.
Go ahead and say it now.
Pretty much any uprising, from the right side of politics, I view as a less likely to happen, just because by and large most people have respect for the institutions. So I view most of the stuff coming from the right in the vein of a quote, "You won't do shit," unquote.
You won't do it. Prove me wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Uh, I think it's a little more likely than you do, but I think it's much harder to provoke on the right.
Well, I guess we should also offer, an olive branch to the other side, if you will. Many liberals would definitely accuse January 6th of being an uprising, right?
Yeah.
So if we want to put it in the same vein as the Summer of Love, as as an outlier, if you will.
Yeah. I agree. The next one, arguably the most entertaining to entertain, is a libertarian uprising.
They are the most you won't do shit of any of the right. You'll see some guy with some warrants get no knocked in his house and die in a police shootout, and then that'll be the biggest libertarian uprising you'll see in the decade.
Yep. You mean Killdozer doesn't count?
He didn't. There wasn't any political aims with that.
He was just, I mean, he was just pissed off at the government. But, I think that's, I mean, I don't know the guy's name, but real libertarian hero right there.
Yeah.
And the next step, I'm just going to ask these together. Uh, the neoconservative or a neoconservative uprising or a neoliberal uprising. They've got a lot of roots intertwined.
I would say
So
out of
it would kind of
anybody,
be like an
but
oh, it would kind of be like a joint uprising between those groups in response to a government of either libertarian, America First, or progressives.
I don't think that they would ever up. They're even more than the typical rights. Where like they are the status quo, right? They value stability, so I don't. They would never, ever.
Yeah, that's fair. I could see, possibly something if, you wound up with a hyper progressive government. But I think even something like the America First movement, they would just sort of wait out.
Well, it's also kind of in the name, funnily enough. A moderate uprising doesn't really sound that threatening.
It's not. uh, can you think of any factions that I didn't list here that,
No. I don't know.
no?
If you want to get real funny with it, you maybe U.S. gangs, but they
But
would,
yeah,
yeah, that wouldn't really be an uprising.
street
That'd just
gang
be,
uprising,
yeah, just be riots.
gang warfare. Uh, you know, I mean, you don't even have enough cohesion religiously to see an uprising in that regard. I mean, outside of regionally. So something for like a national civil war. I think that pretty much covers the bases where there would arguably be enough support for any of them nationwide.
Hmm.
And so of these two, I guess the two that we think would be most likely would be the progressives and the America First side of things. Correct?
Yeah.
Right. What do you think it would take to, you know, provoke a genuine attempt at a progressive uprising to overthrow a government?
Oh boy.
And I mean, keep in mind here, we're not talking about something like a January 6th. We're talking like, you know, they're raiding a National Guard armory and they're, going to war.
I really they're not that reactionary is the thing, right? They have their own views and they hate you for having different views. But they're not reactionary if that makes sense. So I
Um,
like you'll get civil discontent, whether that's, like them spilling out in the streets for like a George Floyd, or wasn't there like protests for like 2 weeks when Trump got elected, right?
there was that. There was also the thing when Zimmerman and George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin shooting in Florida.
Um, huh. Well, I guess I obviously that has a lot in common with the George Floyd thing, right? So,
Like where the race situation was
yeah,
put
yeah,
forward, and that got things more emotional.
yeah. So I think if anything, it would be that kind of a situation, a race situation, and then something else happens to inflame the tensions. And they're already out anyways, and they're already throwing Molotovs at police stations. Might as well throw Molotovs at the National Guard base, right?
Those are slightly different animals.
They are, but you know what?
I mean, you do that at the military base, you're probably immediately going to get shot at. I mean, you do that in Seattle, and they just sort of acknowledge that it's a thing that happens.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's what I'm saying. If they do it
you
in
guys are a
Seattle, they're
Molotov.
suddenly very well armed.
Well, they got to take out the police station first.
Yeah, gotta get some bulletproof vests.
Yeah.
It's that. So I think that would be the
Yeah.
most likely avenue for a progressive uprising.
I, I very much agree. I think it would be something something along the lines of the LA riots turned up to the 11s,
Yep.
where it's something that takes root and then just continues. I don't really, if it did happen, I don't really see it spreading outside of cities,
Yeah, definitely.
major urban centers. The next one, where we think it's much more likely, would be an America First uprising, which you think it's safe to more or less call that largely a rural movement?
I don't know if I'd call it that. I would just call it a Trump movement rather than rural, because there's tons of, urban Trump people.
I guess that's correct. Um,
But I suppose if you were to break it down by territory, I will concede the rural thing to you.
yeah. So, what do you think it would take to actually provoke that group into an uprising? And again, I'm not talking about something like a January 6th. I'm talking about, you know, raiding a National Guard armory, hopping in a Panzer, and going to the state capitol.
Man, I didn't know the National Guard had panzers.
I don't know, probably.
They took one from World War II. They kept it as a display model.
A freaking tank, Colton.
Yeah, no, I'm just messing with you. Um,
Yeah, what do you think it would take to actually provoke them?
Honestly, I feel like the only thing that would happen is like, imagine like Trump gets assassinated. Like that would be it, right? There wouldn't really be anything else.
I actually don't think a Trump assassination would do it. And I don't think that it would be entirely necessary for even like within his lifetime. Um, I mean, we call it the America First movement, but like I'm willing to look at it as being a bit more of a rural thing in this case. And I think that part of I think what could motivate something like that would be mandatory economic decline of rural areas,
What
if
do you
that
mean
makes
by
any
that?
sense. So, for example, in Europe, you've got, you know, governments trying to basically, in a lot of ways, and I'm not even going to pretend I understand the motivation for this, is sort of put a stop to agriculture. I believe was John Kerry made the quote of "We need to reduce agriculture. We need to farm less, otherwise people will starve."
What?
Yeah, I know. Doesn't make any sense to me either.
That's as dumb as if you
But
kill your enemies, they win.
oh, that what a classic Trudeau quote. Uh, but yeah, you're basically something like that where it's mandatory economic decline. Oh, we're going to pass laws so that you can't make a living farming. We are going to make that more expensive for you to do, or we are going to, you know, start taxing manufactories at a higher rate if they're in rural areas and further away from, a, a logistical hub where they can distribute from. Something like that. Which
So
I could see that come from the environmentalist movement.
so in the interest of advancing the conversation, right?
Yeah,
What do you think that that would, you know, realistically look like in America? Because right now, I mean, we have the highest amount of farming subsidies, I think, in the world, right?
yeah.
And, 90% of farms are corporate owned. And I don't think that those corporate, I guess backers or owners would not lobby to continue receiving subsidies. I think
Oh,
the
I think they
agricultural
would
lobby
absolutely
is massive, right?
It's quite sizable,
Yeah.
quite sizable. Uh, Lord, what is it? Some of the I think it's sugar. It's been a while since I looked at this, but I think the sugar industry is one of the largest political donors in the nation as a whole, collectively.
Yeah.
It's really quite impressive. Um, but yeah,
So
I
in
think
it,
beef is another one.
uh-huh. But in saying that, right? In what world
Hmm.
do their, massive lobbying people, and the entrenched structure that that is, the United States is the biggest food exporter in the world, right?
I believe so. I'm almost positive.
Yeah. So in what world do you see
Almost
that, I
positive.
guess, changing for that to be a realistic, you know, standard for our conversation?
I think it would be a very it would have to be a very, very progressive, very, very environmentalist, highly ideological government. Something where whatever they put in the Kool-Aid in Europe that made them suddenly dislike having food, they put it in the Kool-Aid here.
I think even our most, progressive of progressives, right? Like we are number one in the food. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
And other countries they can, be as short-sighted as they want because we exist. You know what I'm saying?
they can. That is a luxury that most of the countries we consider to be allies have.
I just think
Is
with our
that
structure that,
yeah.
it just doesn't happen. Like even our most progressive of progressive people are like,
Oh
we
yeah.
should find greener ways of farming, not we should, get rid of farming.
Yeah. I don't like I said, I don't see it as likely. But it's like the way I would actually see that eventuality happening.
No, yeah, I'm just trying to like, get it through the listeners' heads that holy crap, is this not
Yeah.
likely?
Yes. This is I could see the manufacturing thing much more easily. I could see that one much more easily. But yeah, much more so than the farming. But anyway, right now the conversation that people are having is Republican versus Democrat because those groups aren't fighting amongst themselves enough already. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but believe it or not, these parties have factions, and within the Democratic Party, neoliberals and progressives don't like each other, and in the Republican Party, the America First movement and the neoconservatives really don't like each other either. And depending on the day of the week, the libertarians don't like either of them either. So, it's not exactly like they are well coordinated enough, uh, or cohesive enough, rather, to actually organize something like this. It's actually kind of laughable. But that being said, for the purpose of this conversation, Colton,
Hmm.
we are going to discuss the pretty much 0% chance of a civil war between the left and the right.
Oh boy.
Something which I think, which I don't really see. Uh, just first off, because civil wars usually do have to have a pretty sizable motivation. Um, Usually, that historically looking back, that motivation is most frequently food. Uh, I mean, look at the Russian Revolution. Uh, Look at French Revolution. Food was always like, people go to war when they're hungry because hell, you can starve or you can get shot on a battlefield. One of those ways you are going to die, but at least if you're shot on a battlefield, at least maybe something will change for the better and you might not die.
Hmm.
You know. But anyway, so looking at the right and the left, the first area we're going to discuss is which side is best positioned to sustain violence long term in such a conflict. And the first category in this we're going to look at is manpower willing to volunteer. So in this case, we're generally looking at young men. Which side do you think has an advantage there?
Well, there's two ways you could look at this. Like willing to volunteer strictly for a militia thing, I think that's rural, right? That's a very idealistic thing to look up to, right?
Yes.
But young men willing to commit violence upon others, I think that might go to the urbanites. Just
Uh,
from just the amount of people, that anytime there's a happening, they just go out and start destroying shit. You might have you might have a little bit more on that side just by numbers alone. It's not going to be
oh yeah.
quality or but quantity has a quality all of its own.
You know, Joe Stalin wasn't wrong.
Nope.
And personally, I think you would see. I think the right does have an advantage there, just because they are much more appealing to young men.
Hmm.
And I think that a lot of the urban violence that they've displayed, I'm not sure how sustainable it would be in the face of returning fire.
Well, I guess my one joke answer to this that's kind of true. There's a lot of return fire in Chicago, and they still live there and participate. So
Damn. Next up, uh, again, no military involvement in this. Just on the civilian side, where do you think, which side do you think has an advantage in arms and munitions?
I think from the get go and in knowing how to use those arms, I think the right. Uh, I think there's a lot more opportunity to get large amounts of guns immediately on the left, but if they don't seize that opportunity, then it's pointless. Do you know what I'm saying by that?
Yeah. And I mean, assuming this is early in a conflict, I don't think at very early, the military would not have intervened yet. I
No.
think that there would be some very careful uh, consideration there. And I mean, in a case like that, you might actually, see, a president give an order and the military say, whoa, whoa, hold your horses. Just because there are a lot of risks there. You don't want to risk, putting the military in a position where it does take a side
I think
if
it's
you can put things down naturally and organically, or you're just waiting on it to fizzle out.
I think it's definitely, I guess, on that point. I think, just to bring this to what you said, It's much more likely for the executive to order the military to not participate, to not escalate the situation, I think, rather than, for them to receive an order that they don't do. You know what I mean?
I think both are equally likely. I think it depends on the. I mean, during the American Civil War, one of the biggest and arguably best critiques of Lincoln was that he tried to amass an army quickly, which in a lot of ways was viewed as pushing, what was it, Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina into his arms, into the arms of the Confederacy,
Mhm.
and damn near doing it with Kentucky and Missouri. As I'm not going to pretend the Civil War was not about slavery. Uh, One of the things that was frequently cited in the debates on the matter of secession in those states was the fact that a federal army was being amassed to march through those states, and that was not something they favored. So I would like to think that a sitting president would have learned not to escalate the matter, but in the day and age of current leadership, hell, most leadership within the last 50 years, I'm not sure any of them would display that manner of wisdom.
Yeah.
I do agree with you. I think on presence of personal arms in the event that this rose up and was a conflict among civilians, you certainly do have an advantage on the right. Uh, you have, Lord, what's the statistic? It's something like 60% of conservative households have firearms, whereas it's only like 20% on the left. It's a much greater number of arms on the right, of households with arms. And that doesn't take into account how many arms they tend to have.
Yeah.
And I've spent most of my life in living in the middle of nowhere. And, living in rural areas, basically everybody's conservative. And, you go into, Bubba's house, and Bubba's got 15 shotguns hanging over the fireplace. And it's like, well, that's that's a lot of people you can arm.
Well, I guess let me
The
bring this up though, right?
hmm
So when people, I guess, are arming up and being like, we're getting ready to fight, right? There's a lot of distance between Bubba and the cities. Especially if he's in like the middle of America, where there's like straight up nobody that disagrees with him for like almost 1,000 miles. Meanwhile,
Basically.
on like the left, there's I'll 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 put out a number and be like a 70-30, like dichotomy within the cities, right?
Mhm.
So there's a lot more violence happening immediately. And people that are conservative in the cities might not have 15 guns, but might have 10,
Yeah.
and I think that's still there, and those people will get outnumbered really fast. And then population centers as well. They tend to have
I,
the bases, right?
you know, that's a good point. Uh, Although I think, honestly, I think that in the event that it did come down to civilian versus civilian, that could quite possibly work to the advantage of the conservatives, just because you have a situation where there's going to be infighting in that city, and everything else can just, sort of mobilize freely because there's not that much, difference in a rural community. Basically, everybody's conservative.
Well, I was saying it more from the other side of that. Bubba might not mobilize as fast or as seriously or even care as much because like people from the left, they gotta go over the Rocky Mountains, go through Nevada first, go through all that just before they reach Wyoming. Like,
Yeah,
he's gonna
I
be like, who
agree.
cares?
Yeah, but Bubba doesn't give two dams about cousin Jim Bob in New York. Uh,
Yeah, so the conservatives in the cities might be fucked. They'll be like, reinforcements are coming, guys, and then they'd be like, I don't care about you, city slickers.
Yeah, I think Lord, it's hard to say. It would depend really on how quickly that conservative side could organize in a city, and could they effectively seize control of what was necessary to prevent the left from organizing. I honestly think that
I think, I guess
I'm
just to
trying to
take
remember
this
the
from you,
statistics.
if we
Mhm.
just look at the LA riots, historically, the only community that banded together was the Roof Koreans. Everyone else just left,
That is true.
did not work together, did not help each other. I think ethnic groups, the Koreans might live,
It
but
was based. It was its own basic. It's basically its own little race war.
yeah.
Uh,
So I don't think that they'll band together in the cities. I think they'll just be like, well, that's not happening in my neighborhood, and then the next night it's in their neighborhood, and they don't talk to their neighbors. So what else? You know.
yeah, I don't really know how that plays out. I do think it would prevent the left from consolidating early on, just because they have to deal with so much on the home front. I
But
do think that that's just more time they have to dump.
same with conservatives, but the opposite way. They're just like, this doesn't affect me. I don't care.
Yes, kind of. And the last one, and arguably the most important, going back to what we said before, is food. Which side is best positioned to sustain violence and has the ability to produce, require food to feed their faction in this?
Well, depends on time of year, and for to extend an olive branch to liberals, it depends on if the ports are still operating and if there's shipments coming in soon. If there's not, then they don't have any food and they run out within a week. And then if it's the dead of winter, then conservatives, there might not be any crops on, but they still have whatever they didn't send off to the with the grain truck, if you will, right?
Yeah, I do agree on that. I think that obviously my thoughts are that if something like that happened, somebody's probably going to, suicide bomb a port, do something to make it inoperable. But I think honestly, just because you do have the agricultural base, obviously in rural areas, like I think one of the running jokes that I've heard several people make is that if you look at a county by county map of the election results, you won't see a county that is food efficient, like food self sufficient, colored in blue. So I think on that end, you do have a big advantage for the rural populations. Just because, I mean, even if nothing else, even if you have limited food, you can, sort of supplement that with hunting. You're still going to have people with livestock that can be slaughtered, things
Hmm.
like that. So,
Well, there's an interesting
I,
conundrum with that, though. Like, I will concede the food
mhm,
point to you, and I guess to add on to that before I go to my other point that I was going to say, I'd say it's fair to give the rural people the capacity for replenishment of their food stocks, right?
yep,
And then for the liberals, it would be the capacity for reinforcement from like ports. That would be the trade off, right?
yep,
And then I guess to get
that
into
is
my other
true.
thing, um, I think it's a lot more interesting if you take also into account waters, especially with in the West. I don't know how many important dams there are in the East, just because I don't know. But I know in the
Yeah,
West there are two very important dams, and the cities that control those might have a distinct advantage over some of the nearby rural areas to, kind of get some sustainment, right?
That's true. The control of water is a big deal. In the east, you've got rivers everywhere.
Yeah.
Provided you can, start a fire and boil it, you've got potable water. Um, I think that largely just depends on where that town is located
Well, let me ask a
along that
question that,
river.
might sound a little bit dumb to the viewers, but is the source of the what's the river that goes, the border of Texas? That one? It's the border with Mexico too. What's that river called?
Rio Grande?
Yeah, the Rio Grande. Is
Rio
the
Grande?
source of the Rio Grande the Colorado or no?
I honestly don't know.
I don't know either.
I,
But like if that is, that's a major, I don't know how much Texas uses the Rio Grande for, agricultural help and irrigation. But I know, in California and in, in Arizona, maybe even bits of New Mexico, they use a lot of that, the Colorado River water. And those are two dams that are controlled by liberal areas.
yeah, they are. And I think that does confer an advantage. I think the other side of that, at least with the Rio Grande, is do you provoke a diplomatic issue because you stop the flow of the Rio Grande, or did something like that?
Hmm.
Because all of a sudden you would have Mexico taking sides in a conflict against whoever controlled that city,
Yeah. And I think,
and very justifiably so.
exactly. And they would also care about the Colorado because they receive about 10 or 11% of the Colorado River output. So it's very
Yeah,
important, but it's definitely a bargaining tool to ensure, you're not shot by your neighbors at the very least.
yeah. So, all right. So, as far as sustaining violence based upon manpower, arms and munitions, and food, all of those collectively, who do you give that to? The conservatives or the liberals?
You're really trying to get me to choose conservative outright, but I'm gonna keep extending all
No.
approaches. I'm just gonna say that it depends on the nature of the conflict. If it's a really fast, lightning war, and you see people, doing, uploading, grainy TikTok drone strike videos like the Ukraine war, then like, maybe
Yeah.
liberals might have an upper hand. If it's a sustained conflict over a period of time, and it stretches into crop cycles, then definitely the conservatives.
Yeah. I my personal take is that for getting young men, just because most young men align conservative, given the volume, given that more conservatives generally have arms, and that again you're looking at the red areas of the country having basically all the food production. I have to give the ability for sustained violence long term uh, to the conservative side. That's my personal take. Um, because the manpower side of thing and the area where I'm would be very hesitant. I'm very hesitant to give that, even though they certainly do have more people in the urban areas. I think you're looking at a situation where you're going to have infighting there, and because they would be dependent upon a port for food, that's a situation where a couple suicide bombers later and those ports are inoperable. So I think their food situation would be very vulnerable. So on that end, I've got to go with conservatives for sustainability.
Well, just in the interest again of, devil's advocate, right? The entirety of World War II, minus the United States soldiers, all of those soldiers were very almost starving, if you will, especially the Russian soldiers, and they, had a lot of manpower.
It's true.
So
I mean, they didn't even have guns for everybody.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that, like, it's been done before. It's just the
It
will,
has
right?
been done before. Uh, it has very much been done before. Uh, I mean, if you had a Joseph Stalin type figure leading the other side that had the infrastructure that Joe Stalin had, I think that that is very plausible. But
Again, let me think
I,
about this,
I'll give it to you.
yeah, like, the
I'll
Russians
give it
didn't
to you. I
have
think
much infrastructure by the time they pushed back.
infrastructure. What's that? I mean, the humorously, one of the things that comes to mind in this is the Russian strategy to Napoleon, which is just like, okay, burn the crops and go further inland and wait and make them travel to you. Eventually, if they're not getting foreign imports of food, they're going to starve.
Mhm.
Mess with their logistics. You have enough territory to just sort of let them take, which I don't want to go into too much, but there's a lot of parallels with Russia here. Now that I
It's
think
kind of
about it,
funny that, the liberals would be horrified that their closest, comparison is the Russians of the past.
and I mean, think about it. Honestly, there's a lot of comparisons with to the Russians with just the U.S. in general. Uh, Pushing toward the opposite coast on which they were, founded. Slowly colonizing overland. There's a lot of parallels between the two countries. It's actually kind of humorous, and they were doing it largely around the same time.
That pioneer industrial culture.
Indeed. I mean, hell, what the Russians had to completely recolonize Kiev, I believe it was, after the Mongols had their way with it.
God.
But yeah, there's a lot of parallels. It's actually really humorous. But moving on. Next step would be technological advantages. Um, and Going into this, we're going to be assessing which side has the greatest technological advantages. And the two categories in this, the first one, be who do you think has the greater advantage when it comes to manufacturing, conservatives or liberals?
Depends on how deep the manufactories are into conservative territory because, they need most things nowadays being manufactured need globalized goods and inputs. Most things.
That's true.
So it depends. If it's if it's manufacturing in Houston, they're decidedly liberal. Decidedly, right? But,
Yeah,
if it's the old steel plant in rural Pennsylvania, then they're probably going Republican.
that's true. I mean, in this case, we're basically looking at where that would be because honestly, if it's a factory and it's in a rural area, you know, it could be owned by a George Soros and it wouldn't matter. It would be immediately in the hands of that conservative faction.
Yeah, it's just,
Versus,
yeah, go ahead.
and so in this case, I don't think it comes down to the ideology of whoever's running it so much as the ideology of the local population where that manufacturing occurs.
Mhm. Well, I guess we could go into that one layer deeper. Is where are oil refineries and, gas production facilities? That would be
Gas production.
that'd be pretty
Gas
important.
production is a big one. Gas production. Well, there are two areas where I will talk: arms and munitions, and energy. Energy is overwhelmingly uh, urban areas, Newark and Houston particularly, whereas arms production is now largely in rural areas. Um, I think what was it? As far as firearms production goes, I think Freedom Group is really the only one left producing in New York. I mean, you've got a few small firearms companies there. I believe it's Turnbull. I think Henry is still in New England. Ruger is still in New Hampshire. But a lot of the larger manufacturers, like Beretta, for example, moved to Tennessee. Um, or there was another company that wound up moving to South Carolina. So, but for example, Henry they produce lever action rifles. Turnbull produces admittedly gorgeous uh, takes on classic firearms. Like they produce, not sponsored by Turnbull, but please feel free. You know, we'll totally take a sponsorship if they ever offer. But like for example, they produce like a classic 1911 with the same shitty sights they originally had on it. But that's just a collector's piece, very functional collector's piece, but a collector's piece. Freedom Group, I believe, is the only major one still like mass producing in the heart of New England that I'm aware of. I think several have left Connecticut. It was the other
So in
previously
the
very
interest of
large ones.
asking, how many of these that you named they produce relevant ammo?
Pretty much everybody produces. Most of those are arms companies, but a lot of ammunition companies, like what is it? I believe some of the biggest munition companies in the U.S. are in Missouri. I believe that's where Remington's uh, munition factory is. Uh, Lord, I'm having a moment. Any other day of the week, I would be able to tell you. I know that not far from you in Vegas, you've got a Fiocchi plant where they produce shotgun shells.
Yeah.
Those are the only two that come to mind
So
offhand.
in the interest then of just moving forward with the topic, then would it be just fair to say that those would be also likely the same of wherever they're located, is who they're an asset for?
Yes. That's something where it would be, assuming you aren't seizing military equipment. Neither side is seizing military equipment because that immediately escalates the conflict. That would be your Fort Sumter moment.
Hmm.
And but if you take, civilian asset, you're still having a civilian on civilian civil war. The wherever those are located would be obviously who they would go to. And so on the oil side, I have to say that the refineries, certainly that goes to the left. On the munitions side, that goes to the right. The arms and munitions side. That's my take on it. At least on manufacturing. You think that's fair?
Yeah, just whoever's closest. I think pretty much all of industry is immobile like that, so they're largely capture points for each side.
Yeah. The next would be the high tech industry and IT industry,
I think that's
and
decidedly left.
I think that is decidedly left as well. Um, I think that I don't think it is as one sided as a lot of people would think, but I do think it very much skews to the left, just because Silicon Valley,
I got
the
a
ability
question for
to
you.
communicate. Yep.
It's more of a humorous kind of like pointing out observation, but imagine trying to like do some hacking for the Civil War, right? And you're using like rural broadband internet. It's so slow.
The for what it's worth, I am in a very rural area, and I can get fiber.
Do a lot of people have fiber where you are?
Yes,
All
it's
right.
very common.
I think the vast
Uh,
majority of the rural areas are still not very highly connected like
uh,
that.
Middle U.S., like the area is called flyover country. It's corn country. Be respectful. They grow your food. Um, don't fuck with the people that fuck with your food. You know,
I mean,
good
that could
things
be
to live by.
the entire mantra for the episode, but in the interest,
It
of
could be. It could be. I mean, we've not really discussed how important the food issue is fully, but the yeah, I don't think Middle America has it, but the Southeast certainly has it. So yeah, I think by and large, i- a high tech edge certainly goes to left.
hmm
I think so. On that end, for technological advantage, who do you give that to
we just said the
overall?
left.
Do you give that to the left? I
Yeah,
mean, this includes manufacturing as well, manufacturing and IT.
I think IT and oil refineries are much more important than a steel refinery at the start. A steel refinery is a long term investment, which
I agree.
needs globalized goods.
I think the access to arms production early on, or especially munitions production, is very important. I'm going to give this one a slight advantage to the left, but I think early on it would skew conservative just because munitions and that ability to actually, automate the production of ammunition and having that ongoing.
It's funny, oddly enough, right? You talked
Hmm.
earlier about like Bubba having 15 shotguns on the mantle.
Yep.
Outside of slugs, those are not very suitable for where he would be fighting.
No, not in a rural area. In an urban area, a shotgun would be great.
Exactly, but pretty much everybody that has guns has a shotgun or two. It's like people that have guitars. You don't have
Yeah.
one guitar, you have multiple guitars. It's the same thing with guns. You
Yes. Oh, yeah.
know. I love the comparison of those hobbies.
Kind of.
So,
So next up.
yeah, good.
So moving on to the next question in this. Which side, um, just as a personality characteristic, generally possesses the necessary discipline to bring about a successful conclusion to a conflict? So for the first, basically in this, which side amongst the various people in it do you think would be able to come together and work cohesively better?
Again, is it long term or short term? I guess long term would be Republicans, and not long term. Just recruiting people with the capacity for violence would be the left. They just have more, and they have replacements.
They do.
Not as far to go.
Uh,
It's in their neighborhood. Wherever they go, because they're the ones that would have to expand, right? Wherever they go, there's fighting. It
yeah.
wouldn't be
I
no
mean,
thing.
basically, I think one of the things I have to throw into this is cultural relations. Because, if if you're fighting side by side with somebody who, you know, you are so vastly different from, and you've not had the luxury of, haha, I call it a luxury, of, going through boot camp and getting the, hell knocked out of you and informed that you are going to work with this son of a bitch and you're going to like it, you are going to be pretty heavily dependent upon something that actually allows that cohesion to take place organically. And I think you see that much more present in the right than the left. Just like, for example, you've got the entire Southeast. You've got, I don't know, what would you call it, like Dixieland culture that's sort of shared across the South. You've sort of got that shared Midwestern culture that extends for a very broad area
Well, there's
where
a
you could
New
actually
England
see
culture
that.
and there's a West Coast culture.
Well, yeah, I've lived in New England, and they generally spend all of their time hating the people from Massachusetts.
Yeah, it's a bonding thing. Just like the South spends all their time shitting on Mississippi.
Well, yes,
Yeah, it's the same
but
thing. And the West,
well,
spends all
no,
their
no, no.
time, shitting on California.
We sh- we should own West Virginia.
Well,
You're right.
there you go.
Even though I love West Virginia very much, it's a very nice state, very hilly and full of trees and you know Mothmen and other horrifying things that supposedly exist out there. But
Um,
I think that this is an area where the left really would struggle. I mean, think about all of the like social unrest that is within cities. Like for example, the like going back to like a George Floyd case. This wasn't them getting pissed off at rural Bubba. This was them getting pissed off at each other and then infighting.
it wasn't really at
Then
each
you
other. It was
have,
more the police.
well, at the police.
Yeah,
Ah,
I think shared combat experience would make brothers out of anybody. Like, let's just be real there.
I think it would. Oh, I absolutely think it would. I'm just thinking about the ability to, without having something like a boot camp, to get these people to work together.
Um,
And I think that
Desire for
the
violence.
shared, I mean, desire for violence is all well and good, but shared, I can't remember the Napoleon quote, but you have to speak to the heart and the mind. And I think that, like the rural Southern case of, you know, God and country would be a much more compelling case to get people to work together, especially, your average young man, than diversity, equity, and inclusion of
Uh,
like a progressive group.
Allow me to retort, right?
Go for it.
I think what you said about the South and like their, God and country, I think that is valid. That is a perfectly valid argument. But I think most people that I'm not gonna say fall for it, but believe in that, right?
Yeah.
They're like the South is a very martial culture. You have family lines where people, every generation joins the military, right?
Yes.
I think anybody that's already in that mindset is already in the military or already was in the military. So I think that would lend the South, or at least, rural people. It'd be a lot like like the American Civil War call up, where like 10 dudes would show up and be like, we're the 52nd from Virginia,
Yep.
rather than,
That makes sense.
yeah. And it would be a
So,
lot more just like squad stuff for the left.
yeah, I think you might be right on that. Just because you would see so much more previous military experience really be brought to bear, that those people would already have undergone, military training previously and, know how to operate in those situations and work together just because of that, shared experience.
Well, we were also saying for young men, those when I said those young men might already be in the military, they might not be at home.
Yes. Uh, I don't really want to include it, the fact that like right now you're missing those recruitment marks, like people are dropping out. But I do agree among young men. I think you're likely going to have seen people that grew up in environments where that was the norm, where like they, are familiar with at least, military tradition and military culture.
Yeah, like their dads have been in the military or something.
Yeah.
I
The
think
second son of the farmers,
mhm.
all that. I can see that.
Also in that point where you said, like the young men that would be in the military, but recruitment's down, right?
Hmm.
I guess we should ask the question because it is relevant. How many of those men are unfit to serve rather than, they also just didn't want to join? I think a lot of men are just
That's a,
unfit to serve nowadays.
I believe that's correct. I know that what was it? I was reading earlier today that the Navy had started taking people that had dropped out of high school that did not have a GED or having graduated from high
Oh
school.
yeah, the army is
That
like that
they've
now
gone
too,
to that route.
and Marines. I
Yeah,
think. I think the only one still is that requires it is the Air Force.
I mean, yeah, they probably should, considering basically everything is either piloting or engineering.
Exactly.
So yeah, I can understand that, and I know the Air Force has long had a problem with retention, just because somebody goes into the Air Force, does their 4-year stint, and their skills they got in the Air Force, they come out and they can get an extra zero on their paycheck just from having those skills and not working for the military. So yeah, I'm not sure the extent of what is coming into play with that and where that is impacting most directly. Uh, Depending upon what you read, it's either because, young people are just not interested in a military career anymore. And in other cases, it's because, your rural folk who historically are much more prone to joining the military for tradition's sake have lost interest given the current affairs of the military.
Hmm.
I mean, another one I could throw out is that, people are not very much inclined to join a military when, you've got sabers rattling in both Israel and in, Ukraine. I mean, both of those are pretty significant reasons and understandable reasons why you wouldn't enlist.
That and we didn't even touch upon the fact that just a lot of men these days they're either the most fit they ever been and they still hate the military, or there's like almost no in between, or they're just obese.
Yeah. So let's see. So on that end, regarding which group could have the most cohesion, who do you give that to? Conservatives or liberals?
It's hard again because I said that they would probably have to fight in different ways. Like 10 people who are all probably, second degree cousins at most from some rural town in Virginia are way more likely to like work together and like, be a cohesive unit. But,
Mhm.
the liberals might have like groups of 5 instead, and they're all, semi working well together, but they've all fought together because their fighting is happening much sooner. You know what I'm saying?
That's true. Hmm.
Uh,
Honestly, in this one, I'm going to skew conservative.
mhm.
And I'm going to do it because first off, you are you've got a lot of very long line families who have, been serving in the military since the damn revolution. You've also got, much more of a martial culture where, honestly, I think the biggest area where I see this is like on the left, you keep hearing people say smash the patriarchy. Well, smashing the patriarchy is pretty much the opposite of military order. You can't really stick it to the man when you're being the man.
I suppose. I don't really see how relevant that is though when people start picking up guns.
Mm. I can see it. I can see that being a pretty notable factor.
Here's the factor I can see it affecting things. I can see it affecting things in the fact that like it would disaffect from the recruiting pool. They'd be like, yeah, I don't feel like it. That'd be like, you guys hate me anyways.
Yeah, I yeah. I
But
don't see. I think they would have a harder time recruiting. And
mhm.
assuming you're doing this rapidly, I don't think you'd have time to build that kind of cohesion.
No, you probably
Assuming
just
it was
go
rapid.
rolling right into the neighborhoods, with whatever group you got, and beggars can't be choosers.
Yeah, I don't think it. I think we differ on how quickly we think things would transpire in that regard. I think it would be a much more slow burn to start.
Mm, I don't. I
Yeah.
think I think the slow burn means a lot of different things. Everything is slow burn in rural areas, but
Yes.
so like a 3 month buildup would be like, oh, what's going on over there? It's been in a couple news cycles now for them, right? And then
Yeah.
a 3 month buildup in,
Hmm.
in rural or in urban areas would be like the consolidation of like a city and having a fighting force now.
I don't think they would be able to do that quickly just because of internal differences.
I'm not saying they wouldn't fight each other. I'm saying
Uh,
that the infighting would come afterwards. Infighting always comes in the left afterwards, but especially also on the right. But when they have someone to fight against, and they're all someone common to point their guns at, then yeah, it just remains to be seen whether after they fight their supposed enemy that it doesn't just turn into a sustained riot rather than expanding outwards, right?
yeah. So the next would be which side is I actually I mean this is a question that's frequently asked and I think I'm in in determining who wins a civil war. But I'm going to rephrase it. Do you think that a conflict that this long that of this excuse me, do you think a conflict of this nature would actually last long enough that technological innovation would be a factor?
Mm, no.
I'm inclined to agree with you 100%. I think that this is something where, yeah, it's not the happiest situation, but I think it would be very bloody and likely quite brief. All right. So I suppose there are three questions at the end of this that we kind of have to ask ourselves. Which faction, conservative versus liberal, is in the best position to present a knockout blow to its foes and has the simplest battle plan to win the conflict?
That'd be conservatives. You just starve out your enemy. That's it. If you can, get, I guess, a barricade, or barricade's not the
Mhm.
right word, like a blockade, I guess that's a better word, then
Yeah.
yeah, you win. Congrats, they're
Cut
starving.
off logistics, basically. I mean, New York, you take out the port, pull up a bridge, and you're pretty much halfway there. The other area in this that I have that's really dark, but I feel like it sort of has to be said, is that in looking at this conflict and what would be needed afterward, uh, the left needs a lot more afterward than the right does. The left needs agriculture because they need food. Whereas, the right doesn't really need Twitter or the New York Stock Exchange or anything like that. They can survive without those things. And the US is one of the least, well, this is, let me finish explaining this before anybody listening jumps to judgment. But the US is one of the least integrated economies in the world, the most least dependent upon integration of any economies in the world. just because we produce so many resources. And those raw resources that are harvested largely come, from mines, forests, what have you, and those are mostly in rural areas. The things that the right would need would be, certain infrastructure, oil refineries, those would be important. But again, as dark as this is to say, this could wind up being a very distinct conflict because they don't really need the city itself or the population there. They need the oil refinery. So this could be a very rare instance of a conflict where, you don't have to win so much by seizing enemy territory generally, so much as just killing the enemy, which is again pretty dark, but it opens up, firebombing of Dresden type, you know, actions that would be very viable because they would kill a lot of the population. And that would, very much break the will of the defenders because you could concentrate on that on certain areas where, it's not really going to impact the infrastructure you actually need to preserve. Thoughts?
I pretty much agree.
The next question, would any allies come into play for either side?
I think it depends on the nature of it. If the status quo, for example, is the leading government of, the United States, like the president, then it would be framed by the media and everything as like a terrorist uprising, America dangerous
Yes.
terrorist MAGA uprising. And, surrounding countries and our allies would be likely to favor the status quo. If it were like, a Trump presidency and, a liberal uprising, then, I mean, frankly, I don't think we're going to hear much about it on the news. And I think we would just
Yeah.
try to ignore it as much as possible, and then probably like the National Guard would get sent in.
Yeah, I agree. Um, I think it would be put down pretty rapidly just because of where things were centered. Like, for example, if it was let's just count, throw out both sides of this. If you had a rural uprising against, a Bernie Sanders type figure who was far, like, you would have to be much further to the left and, really have a dislike for agriculture and rural manufacturing in order to really get it. So it would have to be somebody far to the left of Bernie Sanders to really provoke it, I think. But I believe if that was the case, that you might see some assistance coming from other countries for the rebels. Not necessarily in the fashion you would normally think. But for example, I think you could see, Europe, for example, well, not necessarily even assistance. It would just be a more like a geopolitical incident where you would see, you know, Europe want to send things, but all of a sudden, Russia would be threatening them, and so they'd have an enemy on their border, something like that, where nobody's actively assisting anyone. And I think in a similar situation, if the left rose up, you would probably, like you might see some support for them trickle in from some countries in the form of supplies, but I don't think anybody would commit anything. And one thing I'd have to throw out on the Allies side of things is I cannot imagine a world on either side of this where Canada or Mexico got meaningfully involved. Just because if the other side, depending on the state of the war, war. If it was pretty much a foregone conclusion who would win, then I think they would, help one side or the other because they'd want to make nice with whoever was there. But I think if it was inconclusive, neither of them would risk the threat of a hostile rising U.S. government on their border. It's because even after such a conflict, the U.S. would still be such a military superpower. What do you think?
I think you're right on that, but along with your what you were saying about like Russia and stuff, I think with just the amount of subtle instability that we have now, right? As of recording this, it's like 3 days ago, like three U.S. soldiers were killed by Iran, right? That's
Mhm.
already the amount, of they don't really care what we think, and they think we're weak, right? Just
Yeah.
imagine the amount of NATO is weakened because America's focused internally, right? Like NATO's just not doing anything.
Yeah.
Russia and Iran would be so emboldened. I don't know, maybe I don't know the state of South American politics, but maybe there's some old grudges there that need to be shed blood over. But
Yeah.
it,
I
it'd be a mess.
I think that the a lot of countries, particularly the countries that the U.S. has bombed over the years, would and a lot of that is the Middle East. Let's be candid. In a situation like this, I believe that if and I believe there would be long-term benefit in it for them. If like right now, going back to what you were mentioning about oil refineries, we don't really process any of the oil that we produce in the United States. We send that oil elsewhere to be processed, and we import oil that we have facilities suitable to process. It's kind of funny. We don't have the capacity to really, you know, process the oil we produce domestically. It's really kind of funny. But was it? I mean, you could very much see something like, the Arabian countries and Venezuela be like, no, we're not going to send you oil until you figure this out. And so they just stop exporting oil to the U.S., which could, you know, possibly very much hamper that conflict and make it more of a ground, like on foot conflict.
Definitely.
I think that would take a while if it was extended, but that would be something where they would be especially favorable to, something like the American First movement, where it's like they're very staunchly, well, largely isolationist, and they just don't want to be involved in foreign matters. And I think that's something where their policy could play to their advantage, just because they could, oh, Europe wants to send troops. All right, well, we're going to stop selling oil to Europe. And all of a sudden, they don't have anything because Europe has largely been dependent upon the Middle East and Russia for oil of late. It's basically their only option.
Well, I think it would literally be
So
a death blow to the Germans because not being able to use the natural gas from Russia. We've been shipping over. It's really hard to ship over frozen natural gas, but we've been doing it for them. Like Germans would face an energy crisis that they've not seen in 100 years if they did that.
it's true. I mean, I think in this situation, regardless of who is there, assuming it would be, I think it would largely depend, upon the conservative faction. But I think that whether that conservative faction was in control or otherwise, you would have that East Bloc kind of come in clutch for them, provided it is that wing of the Republican Party that is the major conservative player in this, if that makes sense.
Sort of. Yeah, I think we would see a vast decline in terms of globalization, especially because the United States patrols and enforces shipping lanes in the world, and with that done, I think the best case scenario for other countries would be that the U.S. just like the Navy just keeps doing, whatever their last standing order was.
Yeah. And now I guess it's time for the big question. Historically, this the answer to this question has basically decided every civil war in history. Which faction, if any, would the military side with?
Well, it depends on,
Or
how
actually, I'm going
many.
to throw this in
Okay.
as well. Or would the military become its own faction?
I think the military would be its own faction. I think that's far more likely than them joining one or the other. And I think people that are
Uh,
around military facilities would very much want to fall under the security that follows that. That would be a way more likely
yes,
thing, and it would be its own third party.
I think you might be right. The I think it largely depends on which faction is the ruling faction, if you will, of the United States, whoever holds the presidency at the time period, as to and these aren't great odds for anybody. In our line of work, we've kind of seen that the military definitely skews conservative. Uh, at least in votes, generally by a margin of 2 to 1. That's the historical norm. Sometimes upwards of 2.5 to 1, even. But that being said, because of that, I think there is a situation where you could see the military more eagerly take a side, but even then, it would be a very small chance, and that would be regardless of faction, whichever ideology of it, somebody conservative over the government. I think they would have a better chance of, actually getting the military to not just be like, nope, we're not touching this.
Uh, so in regards to that, I think rather than like a whole base flipping sides or a whole platoon, right? I think it'd be much more
Hmm.
likely for some guy to just go AWOL and pack up a truck with however many supplies he can get, and then like just drive that back home to take care of his family, and then give out shit to the militia around his house, right?
Yeah, I could see that happening. Another area that hasn't really come up in this would be the National Guard, and that's kind of a big deal. Um, Trying to remember, I don't have the numbers in front of me for this. We wanted to do this episode more as a casual conversation than trying to, hash over numbers because there's no way we can possibly analyze every single aspect of this in the course of a single video. But what is it? It's like the Georgia National Guard, I believe. What Georgia and Alabama together are as large as the California National Guard. You just have a much larger military presence in those areas. And I suppose the question becomes, do you think the National Guards would become involved in a conflict like this?
Maybe in a state like Alabama.
And yeah. And do you think that they would, like, I could see him doing it in Georgia, just because going back to it is still large. Looking back at a lot of these conflicts, those kinds of, local soldiers generally aligned the ideology of the local area.
Hmm.
And I don't know enough on the independent breakdowns. Like Georgia is one where, you've got a huge population center of Atlanta. And does that where does the members of that skew? Because you could very much see that be, a largely rural block where it's like, yep, we're siding with them. I don't care what the governor says, go screw yourself. or
Well, I guess I have a
things like
question in that regard, right?
Mhm.
So are the National Guard in Georgia, for example, are they in like headquartered in Atlanta? Like that's where their base is, or do they have like spread out bases?
They would certainly have bases all over the damn place.
Well, I think, within like islands like that, like within like Atlanta, for example, I think the guard would probably take all the shit they can and then just go home rather than, be surrounded in an unknown scenario.
Yeah.
So,
Uh,
you might see some dudes rolling around with, like a armored truck.
one thing I do think in this kind of situation would be that probably most governors, like whenever the federal government wants to make use of the National Guard, they have to get approval from the governor. I think you would see a lot of governors just outright say no to the federal government because they don't want to become entangled and they're trying to limit damage locally.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like in the face of inaction, a lot of those National Guard people would just go home and like with supplies.
Yeah. So, this as a whole, who wins American Civil War II electric boogaloo more often? Just running through all of these possible scenarios in your head. Which side wins more often?
Um, I would say I'd say the Republicans more often. I'd say it's not a 90-10% chance, but I'd say Republicans win more often.
Uh, I have to keep coming back to food.
Yeah, I know
I
you do.
believe that is it's just one of those things. I mean, it's the thing that provokes a lot. Go figure, people get angry when they're hungry, and troops don't march on morale or ideology; they march on a full stomach. And looking at the situation for a city where you might have across everybody there, you might have a month or so's worth of food. You're looking at a situation where you could destroy a few major. Basically, you've got a few targets that you could hit and cut them off largely. I think that gives them a distinct advantage. Again, I agree with you. It's not a 90-20. And I think it
90-10.
also comes down to who. Oh, excuse me, 90-10. I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that. But, I do think it's noticeably more often just because rural populations generally do have an advantage in civil conflicts. Just because, you have to preserve your agricultural industry. It's kind of important. Uh, I mean, go figure that a nation, needs the basic things for survival. So I do think that in this case, I think it would probably be like maybe a 65-35, 70-30 split that I give Republicans. So- excuse me. But I do think that there is a decided advantage there just from the combination of food and where you would actually see a lot of those people that do have experience, like your veterans, fall. I, I I see that as being an advantage. You agree on those numbers?
I would push it only as high as 60-40.
60-40? That's fair. So
It would take a
I
lot of coordination to effectively blockade, every blue area, right? Or,
oh yeah,
majority population centers. And I think that could probably be the federal government would see that as some form of terrorism before it sees that as a civil war. So I don't know how effective a strategy that would be from the get go, right?
Yeah. The other area that didn't really come up, we haven't brought up yet, is the phrase divide and conquer,
Hmm.
which, I mean, if you look at a lot of these blue areas on a map, they're pretty much isolated. And certainly there is an advantage with manpower that they have. But a lot of those areas would have to eat a lot of territory to feed themselves.
Yeah, I'm just
So I
thinking,
think that,
oh, go ahead.
yeah, I think that is another factor we haven't really thought about too much, is just the how isolated a lot of these pockets are. Like you would essentially have New England and the West Coast. So you'd have half, basically a full country between the two factions that would be trying to coordinate against an enemy.
I think it's a bit more than that. Like, let me put it this way, right? You can divide into
Hmm.
further things. So, for example, I know that there's a lot of, especially in the southeast, there's a lot of rural black populations, right?
Yeah,
I think they'd be a lot more
especially
likely,
Mississippi.
yeah, they'd be a lot more likely, side with their urban, compatriots rather than, Bubba 3 miles down the road.
That's true. But
So
I think in
you,
those cases, those are a fairly small minority of the population. And the area where I have to throw out in this is I'm in the situation I think where you would actually see it. I'm not sure it would be strictly Republican and Democrat so much as I think you would see some degree of it would be urban, like a faction of urban Republicans, and then basically the rural population, just generally. Because the kind of thing that would actually drive this over the edge, I think, would be something so significant that it would impact the rural community beyond the conservative liberal divide, if that makes sense.
yeah, I get what you're saying.
So I don't think that this would be strictly a Republican Democrat thing. I think this would be, certain factions within urban areas and then the rural population. Um, basically, I don't agree with you on jack shit, but we both don't like going hungry. So let's beat the shit out of them. That sort of situation. Or I don't like the idea of poverty. Let's, stick it to the other guy.
Makes sense.
And I mean, these are small communities. I mean, I grew up in a small town, and even people of different. Like, it's kind of funny. Uh, you know, I knew Republicans and the few Democrats in my hometown, and there were next to no issues that they disagreed on. They just voted for their respective parties because reasons. So I'm thinking that, again, going back to that, this kind of situation would be something where both sides are irreversibly pissed off at the urban population. I think that would be how it would work out. So I don't think that this would ultimately be a so much a Republican versus Democrat thing as we initially thought.
Yeah.
So with that, I believe we have pretty much said all there is to say, or at least all that should be said. No doubt something like this would be pretty nasty, though I personally do believe a national divorce, you know, not necessarily a national divorce, but a national separation to, wait for tempers to stop flaring might be for the best. But to you poor bastards who are still listening, thank you for doing so. And we hope to entertain you again in next week's episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Take care.
Take care, everyone.